Hey everyone, welcome back to the How to Japanese podcast. This is season 3, the Murakami Haruki season. Today I'll be going through Murakami's bibliography from 1988 to 2005. During this time, Murakami begins to be translated widely. He gradually grows in popularity. He spends many years abroad as an anonymous writer, and then this image of him abroad is kind of projected back to Japan. Toward the end of this period, he skyrockets in fame. I chose these dates because I feel like there was a massive response in Japan to 1Q84, so it felt appropriate to kind of make that the dividing point. And that's between the two novels, After Dark and 1Q84. 2005 is also around when Murakami becomes celebrity level famous in the US, so I think it's also an interesting place to look at Murakami's transition. This is also the period when Murakami's translators catch up to him. By 2005, he's beginning to be translated almost simultaneously with his writing. I also wanted to mention something that I forgot to say explicitly last episode, which is the prizes that Murakami won for his early writing. He won the Gunzo Prize for New Writers in 1979 for Hear the Wind Sing. In 1982, he won the Noma Prize, which I think is also for new writers, for A Wild Sheep Chase. And then in 1985, he won the Tanizaki Junichiro Prize for Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World. You can follow along with the podcast at bit.ly/Murakami Bibliography. I created a Google Sheet with all of this information in one place. Now let's get started with 1988. Murakami is still in Europe at this point and will be until 1989. I won't track his travels as closely as I did in the last episode because I haven't studied them as much, but I will say that Murakami returns to Japan briefly in 1990, and then goes back to the US from 91 to 93 to write and teach at Princeton. And then in 93 to 95 to write and teach at Tufts. And then in 2005, he again returns to Boston to spend time at Harvard. You can follow all of this more closely in Jay Rubin's book, Haruki Murakami and the Music of Words. He tracks Murakami's travels pretty closely. In 1988, Murakami publishes 2 translations, one essay collection/translation and one novel. On March 15th, 1988, he publishes I Remember Grandpa, a collection of Truman Capote's short stories. Murakami calls Capote his first love. He read a bilingual version of The Headless Hawk in high school, but he didn't want to try and translate that first. It felt like too much of a challenge, so he starts with his simpler collection. The next month, April 8th, 1988, he publishes the Scott Fitzgerald book, which is 8 essays by Murakami and 2 translated short stories, which are new for the book. The Rich Boy and On Your Own. The essays were published from 1983 to 1986 in the Suntory Quarterly and a couple other publications. So Murakami continues his obsession with F. Scott Fitzgerald. On September 15th, 1988, Murakami publishes an anthology of short story translations called And Other Stories, Totte Oki no Amerika Shousetsu 20 hen. And that's an anthology of 12 stories translated by Murakami, also by Shibata Motoyuki, Hatanaka Yoshiki, and Saito Eiji. They all helped him when he was translating the John Irving novel Setting Free the Bears. And then he also had Kawamoto Saburo do some translations. This is an original selection of American writers. Murakami calls them all minor writers. This is where he first translates Grace Paley, and he'll go on to do her story collections. For this collection, he translates the stories Samuel and Living by Grace Paley, in addition to a few others. I should say that all of the writers aren't minor writers. Murakami just says a few of the writers were minor writers, and he was pleased to have them published here. The writers also include people like Joyce Carol Oates, Thomas Pynchon, Donald Barthelme, and a few other famous short writers, I think. On October 24th, 1988, Murakami publishes Dance, 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 his next novel. The afterword states that it's a continuation of the story from his first 3 novels. And in this one, Murakami's Boku narrator feels drawn by Kiki, the girl from A Wild Sheep Chase, who now has a name. He also feels drawn by the Dolphin Hotel. So he goes back to Sapporo, only to find that the hotel's been completely redeveloped. This sets him off on a kind of passive adventure of sorts. He discovers Kiki in a movie with an old classmate, ends up accompanying a young girl, Yuki, back to Tokyo from Sapporo and meeting her crazy artist family, and falls in love with a quirky receptionist at the Dolphin Hotel who is also capable of kind of going to the sheep man's hovel in the depths of the hotel. The narrator likens writing and publishing to shoveling cultural snow and criticizes late-stage capitalism while scarfing down Dunkin' Donuts almost every day. I think the key thing to think about Dance 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 is that it's a bubble novel pretty clearly. I think the hotel redevelopment shows that. The narrator spends a lot of time also like waiting for things to happen, for other characters to have realizations, specifically Yuki, who feels a lot like a combination of the Okada sisters and Kasahara Mei in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle in her kind of divination abilities and just intuition. He wrote this book 9 months after Norwegian Wood. So he finishes Norwegian Wood on March 27th, 1987, takes about a 9-month break. He's working on other stuff clearly, and he starts writing Dance 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 on December 17th, 1987. This is, he notes in the afterword. So it starts on December 17th and writes until March 24th, 1988. So again, he's writing a novel in 4 months, and he's not rewriting a short story this time. He's starting from scratch, and it gets published a year and a month after Norwegian Wood, which is crazy, but also I think it shows in the writing. It is pretty rough if you give it another reread. All right, that's 1988 in 6 minutes, so we'll see how long it takes to get through the 16 other years. 1989, Murakami publishes 4 translations and 1 work of nonfiction. On April 20th, 1989, he publishes A Small Good Thing by Raymond Carver, the translation of that. The Japanese title is Sasayaka Dakeredo Yaku ni Tatsu Koto. This is an original selection of Carver stories. Carver died in 1988, and Murakami intended this collection as a memorial. They were published in journals from 88 to 89, the title story in Bungakukai, but others in Marie Claire Japan and Shinsho. One interesting note is that Murakami initially translated the title story as Sasayaka Dakeredo Tasuke ni naru koto, but he adjusted that to Yaku ni tatsu koto for the collected edition, so he's still editing his works here. On May 20th, 1989, Murakami publishes the nonfiction essay collection Murakami Asahido Hai-Ho. So this is again the Murakami Asahido, House of the Rising Sun tagline that he's using for some of his collected essays. This is 31 essays. He wrote a column called Random Talking in the magazine High Fashion from August 1983 to December 1988, and he took 1987 off from that. He took 23 of these columns and then 8 essays from other publications, and these are on random topics like Jim Morrison, movies, and seeing opera for the first time. And Murakami ends 1989 with 3 translations. On September 1st, he publishes a translation of The Stranger by Chris Van Allsburg. This is another illustrated book that was originally published in 1986. On October 1st, he puts out the translation of The Nuclear Age by Tim O'Brien. He translated this because he personally liked the book, and he says it felt like a personal discovery because O'Brien's breakout novel, Going After Cacciato, hadn't been published yet. And then on December 15th, 1989, he publishes One Christmas by Truman Capote. He categorizes this as one of Capote's simple, innocent works. Murakami has kind of divided Capote's works into simple, innocent writing and then more kind of complex urban/city fiction. In 1990, Murakami is tremendously productive. He puts out 1 short story collection, 2 essay collections, 5 translations, and starts the publication of his complete works, which collects the first 10 years of his career from 1979 to 1989. He's back in Japan for 1990, and the first thing he publishes on January 25th, 1990 is the short story collection TV People. This includes the stories TV People, Airplane, or How He Talked to Himself as if reciting poetry, The Folklore of Our Times, A Prehistory of Late-Stage Capitalism, Kano Kreta, Zombie, and Sleep. This is another set of mostly solid short stories, pretty varied, a lot of realism, but also some kind of weird stuff. All but 2 of them are translated. Zombie, I don't think has been translated. And then also Kano Kreta, which is Kreta Kano, if you put the name in Western order. You might recognize that name from the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. It's a very bizarre little short story, not very good. So not a surprise that it hasn't been translated. It's told from the point of view of Kreta Kano, and it's about the Kano sisters that you might recognize from the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Creta's sister Malta has an affinity with water. Creta herself has been violated by many men, so she stays indoors. And in the story, they even kill a police officer who tries to assault her and bury the officer in the garden. Very bizarre little short story. In May 1990, Murakami begins to publish complete works, several different complete works, in a 2-day period. On May 20th, 1990, he publishes the first of Raymond Carver's complete works, his translation of Raymond Carver's complete works. This is Cathedral, the complete works of Raymond Carver, Volume 3. It's the third because it's the third work that Carver published. It's the first to be translated, but the third that Carver wrote or that Carver published. So that's why it gets the designation 3. Murakami was in Italy in 1998 when Carver dies, and he decided that he would translate Carver's complete works. That's how big of a fan he was. He had previously translated Carver, obviously, but all the collections were kind of original selections. Now he starts translating the works as they are, one at a time. Cathedral's the first to come out, and Murakami calls it his most meaningful. The story itself was published in the magazine Umi in May 1983, along with 6 other stories. Murakami had invited Carver to visit him in Japan, and Jay Rubin even says that Murakami had a large bed made for his house to host him because Carver was so tall. Unfortunately, Carver never has that chance to make the trip. This must be a project that Murakami started while he was in Europe, and they begin to be published periodically. The very next day, on May 21st, 1990, Murakami puts out the first of his own complete works, the Murakami Haruki Zen Sakuhin, Murakami Haruki Complete Works, 1979 to 1989, Volume 1. This includes Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973. It's a little bit strange putting out your complete works while you're still alive. I think mostly complete works are something that happens in Japan when you're later in your career or even posthumously. But I think this reflects his incredible popularity after Norwegian Wood and how prolific he was during those first 10 years of his career. The volumes are published every other month starting in May, and they each include a small pamphlet titled Jisaku o Kataru, which translates as telling the story of my works. This is a title that many different writers have used to talk about their own works. Murakami goes into depth about the writing process, and I really can't recommend this collection highly enough. It's worth buying the whole thing, or if you only have specific interest in one or two of Murakami's works, picking up that one in particular. You can probably find used copies. They won't be discounted quite as heavily as his paperbacks or even his hardcovers, to be honest, but you can probably get away with picking up 1 or 2 volumes individually for not too much money. My copy is back in the US. I got a copy as a farewell gift from the town where I was living on the JET program. They didn't pay for the whole thing, but they paid for part of it. So I got a heavily discounted version myself that I've been reading through over the years. On June 25th, 1990, Murakami publishes Toi Taiko, Distant Drums, which is a travel memoir from his time in Europe, divided into small essays and ordered chronologically. There are photos from his wife, Yoko. I've read about half of this and blogged closely about it. So if you look through my past posts, you'll find some information about it. It's really an incredible set of writing, and I'm confident that it will be translated at some point. If editors aren't aware of it, you're really missing out. My best guess is that the only thing preventing the translation is Murakami himself, much like he did with Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973. Some scenes from the work that really come back to me are Murakami arriving in Europe and being so distracted with the working pace in the Japanese literary world that he was just exhausted, and he kind of personifies this with, or maybe not personifies it, but he invents these 2 mosquitoes that are kind of like annoying him in his ear, buzzing in his ear, and he gives them 2 names, and that for him is that exhaustion. There's another section where Murakami has forgotten to cash traveler's checks, and this annoys his wife, so they have to spend one weekend living very frugally. There's another where they drive to the top of a rural mountain and look out over this kind of the end of the world, I think they call it, with an Italian who grew up there. There's another section where he's trying to run in Italy and he's being chased by dogs. Another where his apartment is flooding during a storm and he's trying to write. And there's also the random hotel where he stayed while finishing Norwegian Wood. There's really some great writing in this collection. And it's very interesting because Murakami's talking a lot about himself. He had a lot of reasons why he wanted to go abroad in 1986. The top three seems to be that he wanted to focus and write. Two, he mentions some financial reasons, kind of vaguely. It might have been cheaper for them to live there. And then also he just wanted to travel. And here's a short little passage. I was turning 40. That was the one thing that compelled me to go on a long trip. But it wasn't just that. There were a number of other reasons I wanted to get away from Japan. That included several positive reasons and several negative reasons, practical reasons and metaphorical reasons. But I don't want to get into them right now, because at this point, I honestly don't care about them at all. They are neither here nor there to me, and likely neither here nor there to the reader as well. No matter what kind of realistic reasons compelled me to travel, the long trip washed away the original reason that generated it, at least in effect. That is, one day suddenly, I had to go on a long trip. To me, that feels like the ideal reason to go on a trip. It's simple and persuasive, and it doesn't overgeneralize. One day I woke up, and when I listened carefully, I could hear the sound of drums somewhere far in the distance. The sound of drums came to me from somewhere far, far away, from some long time ago, ever so faintly, and as I listened to them, I felt I had to go on a long trip. That should be enough, no? I heard distant drums. At this point, that feels like the only honest reason that compelled me to travel. On August 20th, 1990, Murakami puts out the second volume of the translation of the complete works of Raymond Carver. This is what we talk about when we talk about love. Murakami calls translating Fitzgerald and Carver critical training, but has said that Carver was almost more important because he was a living writer, so I think they overlapped and maybe the language was fresher. On August 28th, 1990, Murakami puts out another volume of travel writing titled Uten Inten, which would loosely translate as Rain and Heat. It's a kind of slim 2-volume travel writing about his time in Greece and Turkey. They have the subtitle In the Holy Mountain and On the Turkish Road. They have a lot of different photos in this. I haven't read it, but it's near the top of my to-read list after doing this project. This book and the book about visiting factories with Anzai Mizumaru. There are a lot of different editions of this book. There's the original 2-volume hardcover, which comes in a nice little box set. There's a bunkobon version, which is nice and portable. And then there's a larger paperback version that has photos. And the photos are different between the paperbacks and hardbacks. So it's kind of like, Murakami, again, publishing like a musician might, with special albums, with new tracks and stuff like that. So fans of Murakami are always getting extra content. Murakami next puts out 2 volumes of his complete works. On July 20th, he publishes the second volume, which includes A Wild Sheep Chase. And then on September 20th, he puts out short stories, the third volume, which is Short Stories 1. This includes the stories in 2 collections, Slow Boat to China and Firefly Barn Burning and Other Stories. It also includes a new Kakioroshi story, Rainy Day Woman, number 241 and 242. On October 1st, Murakami publishes the translation of The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Honto no Senso no Hanashi o Shio is the Japanese title. Murakami translated these short stories as they were published in magazines, and he notes that O'Brien made a lot of changes when they were published in the collected edition, which gave it more of a novelistic character. He also says that he sees his own writing style reflected in O'Brien's writing, specifically the combination of realism and non-realism. On November 20th, Murakami puts out the 4th volume of his complete works, which is Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World. This is the extra commentary that I'm most familiar with. The commentary included with this volume is the one that I'm most familiar with. It's where Murakami discusses the novella, The Town and Its Uncertain Wall. And I think it's going to become more and more important as we learn about this novel and read this new novel, because it's where Murakami discusses why he thinks it was a failed work and why it's still important, because it gave him the footing to write Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World. Murakami finds time to squeeze in 2 more translations in 1990. In November, he puts out a translation of The Mysteries of Harris Burdick, another Van Allsburg book, and also A Christmas Memory by Truman Capote, another one of Truman Capote's quote-unquote innocent works, as Murakami might put it. In 1991, Murakami goes back abroad to Princeton, and that's with the help of Elmer Luke, the editor of his first few translations, who helps connect him with some of the academics there. He spends 2.5 years there and then another 2 in Cambridge. In 1991, he continues to put out his complete works, and he publishes 2 translations. On January 21st, Murakami publishes the 5th volume of his complete works. This is Short Stories Set 2. It includes stories from Kangaroo Biori, A Perfect Day for Kangaroos, and Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round. It also includes the additional story, The Silence, which was translated in The Elephant Vanishes. I think there may be one other additional short story. I'm not certain. But Murakami admits that they were all made up in the supplementary commentary for this volume. But again, like I mentioned in the last episode, he likes this format that he kind of created in Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round, he relating to the reader a true story he heard from somebody and telling not only that story, but how he heard that story. That's a format that Murakami likes, and he uses that format to tell that story, The Silence. I just double checked, and it does look like there are a couple additional stories that Murakami added to A Perfect Day for Kangaroos that are included in the complete works. And actually, I found a really interesting blog post that kind of summarizes all the quote-unquote secret short stories by Murakami. That's at least what they're calling it. It's a Japanese blog post that details how you can track down some of these short stories that weren't published in the initial books and where you can find them. And it actually includes the town and its uncertain wall. So look for that link in the blog post. On February 20th, Murakami puts out the next volume in the translation of the complete works of Raymond Carver. This is volume 1. Will You Please Be Quiet, Please? And the Japanese, I realizing now that I probably should have given the Japanese translation for all of his translations. So I'll try and do that going forward. And that translation here is Tanomu kara shizuka ni shite kure. This is a collection of Carver's early works, and Murakami seems to be aware of the Gordon Lish connection with Carver. Gordon Lish was the editor who heavily edited Carver's early works and kind of created that minimalist style that Carver's really well known for. These stories were later published in their original editions, and Murakami translates both of them. He doesn't really comment on them here in his book on translation, but we'll see what he says when he publishes the full versions. The rest of 1991 is dominated by the publication of Murakami's complete works. On March 20th, Volume 6 comes out, which is Norwegian Wood. On May 20th, Volume 7 comes out, which is Dance, Dance, Dance. And on July 22nd, Volume 8 comes out, which is Short Stories Set 3. This collects stories from the second bakery attack. It also includes, as a bonus, or kakioroshi, Sleep, Tonitakitani, and Man-Eating Cats, which is the story that would go on to become Sputnik Sweetheart. And then on December 1st, Murakami publishes a translation of Swan Lake by Mark Helprin and Chris Van Allsburg. It's an illustrated retelling of the ballet. And in regards to this book, Murakami mentions that he'd love to work with Chris Van Allsburg. So if you're out there, man, give your friend Murakami a call. That would be an amazing collaboration to see. In 1991, Murakami publishes 1 translation and 2 novels. We'll have to wait and see. On September 1st, 1992, he publishes the next volume in his translation of the complete works of Raymond Carver. This is volume 4, so the 4th chronological Carver work, which is Fires. It's a collection of stories, poems, and essays. Murakami notes that it was difficult to pick a pronoun for Carver's fiction at first. The fiction felt very blue-collar to Murakami, so he felt like maybe the boku, I narrator, might not work. But then he met Carver, who ended up being much gentler than he expected after having read his fiction. He also talks about memories of having tea at Carver's home and how helpful that experience was for his translation. Oh, and the title of that translation was literally Fayaz, with Hono in parentheses. And then we get to the novels. In the October 1992 issue of Shincho, Murakami begins the serialization of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle Book 1, which is written while he's at Princeton. And this goes on for 10 issues. Part 1 is a kind of post-bubble novel, post-war novel. Toru Okada is out of work, and the setup is really nice. I think it details him struggling, being unemployed, and searching for his lost cat, encountering Mei Kasahara, the Kano sisters. It introduces his connection with his wife Kumiko and her family background, including her brother Wataya Noboru. Talks about their counseling with Mr. Honda, his death, and then book one ends with Lieutenant Mamiya's story. It's really nice and patient, I would say, very subtle, really sets up a nice tension, I think, for the rest of the novel, and is, I think, a return to form after Dance, Dance, Dance. One thing I don't know too much about is the difference between the serialized version and the tankobon hardcover version of book one of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. It seems like that would be a really interesting area to look into in order to get a sense of how Murakami is editing himself, what he was trying to do with the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and whether or not he's able to pull that off by adding book two and book three. And then later that same month, on October 12th, Murakami publishes South of the Border, West of the Sun, his next novel. And so you could almost say he published two novels in the same month. This book is told by a typical Murakami narrator who comes of age in the late 60s, grows up into Japan's economic miracle, and then starts running a bar after marrying a relatively well-off woman. He can't seem to shake his obsession with a childhood friend and eventually has some sort of affair, even if it's kind of illusory. It's never really clear whether she exists when she comes back into his life. This is a kind of early post-bubble novel. Again, like I mentioned in the last episode, stock trading is a point of marital discord. Murakami's returning to his themes of surrogacy, of trying to replace desires from childhood. But as with Dance, 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 the narrator kind of ends up sticking through with the relationship that he's got, stays in his marriage, even though he was ready to run off with the childhood friend before she disappeared for good. The writing style between this book and the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle are very different, and it almost surprises me that they're published in the same month or they overlap so closely, because the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle seems much more under control and complex compared to South of the Border, West of the Sun, which is much closer to Dance, 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 I would say, in terms of the style of the narration. In 1993, Murakami publishes one novel and three translations. The serialization of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle Book 1 continues until August. In March 26th, he publishes a translation of Ursula Le Guin's Cat Wings. The translation is Soratobi Neko. A reader sent him a copy, Murakami says, and that reader happened to be Fukuoka Shinichi, a famous biologist and writer who's written about Vermeer. Fukuoka did that when he was a postdoc, and apparently they were friendly. Murakami is a big fan of cats. He also likes Le Guin, he says, so he translated this series of illustrated children's books, 4 in total, 2 of them in 93, 1 in 97, and the final in 2001. On June 26, Murakami puts out a translation of The Widow's Broom by Chris Van Allsburg, another illustrated children's novel. This was published in 1993, so it's a contemporaneous translation. In August, Murakami finishes the serialization of Book 1 of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and then on November 22nd, he publishes the translation of Cat Wings Returns by Ursula Le Guin, and that Japanese title is Kaete Kita Soratobi Neko. In 1994, Murakami publishes one novel, one work of nonfiction, and 5 translations. On January 8th, he puts out a translation of sudden fiction, which the Japanese title is Chotanpen Shosetsu Nanaju. It's a collection of short shorts. It includes works by Grace Paley, Barry Hannah, Donald Barthelme, John Cheever, John Updike, Langston Hughes, Raymond Carver, and Joyce Carol Oates, amongst others. It's translated with Ogawa Takayoshi, who is a translator and English literature scholar. Murakami makes it sound like it was relatively easy to divide up the stories between them, and I'm not sure who did which stories. I think it's likely that Murakami did the Grace Paley shorts. He says that they were good study for his own shorts. On February 25th, Murakami publishes an essay collection titled Yagate Kanashiki Gaikokugo. I don't know exactly how that would be best translated, or I don't know if there exists an English translation. I don't think there is. but I guess taking a stab at it would be something like inevitably lonely foreign languages. It sounds like he's making some kind of literary reference with that phrase, but I'm not totally sure. He says it's a phrase that just kind of came to mind. He wrote these while he was at Princeton, and they were serialized in a magazine called Hon, which is the word for book in Japanese. They were serialized between August 92 and November 93. They're longer essays than he usually wrote, but he says that he never had an issue making any of the deadlines. They're about life in the US. And the title essay kind of just describes feeling a loneliness inherent in not using a native language. And it talks about him taking Spanish classes while he was at Princeton because he was planning on a trip to Mexico. These are high on my list of to read Murakami works that I haven't read through. Based on Wikipedia summaries, and the titles of these essays, he's writing about running, Stephen King, studying Spanish, jazz, and baby boomers. On March 7th, Murakami publishes the translation of the next volume of the complete works of Raymond Carver. This is volume 6 at this point. It collects Elephant / A New Path to the Waterfall, and the translation is Zo / Taki e no Atarashi Komichi. This is a collection of stories and poems. Murakami specifically cites the Errand as one story that is interesting and maybe suggests a new direction for Carver's work after Cathedral, one that Carver doesn't really live long enough to fulfill. He's dying as he writes this story. It's a work of kind of historical fiction almost that tells the story of Chekhov's death from tuberculosis. It's told from both a historic point of view and then the point of view kind of attaches to this helper boy at the hotel where Chekhov dies. I mentioned it in not the last episode, but I think in the Power Rankings in relation specifically to the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, because this is around when he's writing the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and it's likely that he translated this well before 94, probably in 93 or 92, as he's writing that novel. And then we get Lieutenant Mamiya's story at the end of that serialization and at the end of book 1. And so to me, it feels likely that The Errand is a huge inspiration for the way he decided to write the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. He's been kind of inspired by Carver his whole career, and now is inspired to shift directions in his writing along with Carver. On April 12th, Murakami publishes the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, books 1 and 2. So this is a year and a half after the serialization for book 1 began. Murakami makes some revisions for the hardcover publication. In book 2, Kumiko disappears. Toru is confronted by her brother, Wataya Noboru, at a hotel with Malta Kano, and told that Kumiko has another man and has no interest in staying married. There are numerous chapters at the bottom of the well, which Murakami nicely uses flashback to tell more about his relationship with Kumiko and her family. He ends up sleeping with Kreda Kano, and he learns that Mae Kasahara killed her boyfriend on the motorcycle. Toru resolves to go to Crete with Kreda Kano, but is talked out of it by his uncle. And then there's a random encounter with the man with the guitar, which seems to kind of help Toru realize he has to stay and wait for Kumiko. And then he realizes that the woman on the phone is Kumiko, the one that initially kind of called him in chapter 1. The narration is much closer to Dance, 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 kind of rambling, passing time, creating these suggestive moments for readers to work with. So I don't know if it really comes together as a novel. The book 3 helps kind of tighten it up a little bit, but even that, I think, isn't 100% successful. There are a lot of connections with his other works in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Obviously, the Kano sisters are from the short story Kano Kreta that's in, I think, TV People. And then Tony Takitani was also a short story. He's the owner of the abandoned house in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Toru does work for the Wig Factory with Mae Kasahara, and Murakami and Anzai Mizumaru went to a wig factory for their essay collection. Watanabe Noboru is Anzai Mizumaru's real name, and here Murakami swaps Watanabe for Wataya. And then Kasahara Mae actually ends up in a short in Yoru no Kumozaru. One other little interesting piece of trivia that I learned while researching this is that in a 1995 interview in Shincho, Murakami says that sections that were cut from the first draft of the book ended up in South of the Border, West of the Sun, which is really interesting to me because the books are so different, but I can see it kind of. There's in South of the Border, West of the Sun, there's this tension between the narrator and his father-in-law, which seems to kind of be somewhat similar to the tension between the two families in the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. On September 22nd, Murakami publishes a translation of The Sweetest Fig by Chris Van Allsburg. The translation of that is Masayume. Let me see if I can get this one. Masayume Ichijiku. Masayume Ichijiku. This is another Allsburg picture book published that was originally published in 1993. On October 1st, Murakami publishes a translation of Carver Country, The World of Raymond Carver. That translation is literally Kaba Kantori. It's a book of photographs by Bob Aderman with an introduction by Tess Gallagher. It's not part of Carver's complete works. It's a book of photographs of Washington State that I guess gives readers a sense of the background for many of Carver's stories. On November 25th, he publishes a translation of Carver's Dozen, Raimondo Kaba Kessakusen. This is a collection that's a kind of best of selected by Murakami. These are stories that he likes that could serve as an introduction for readers who are new to Carver. And it's not part of the complete works. It's published along with that. The stories included are Why Don't You Dance, Cathedral, Where I'm Calling From, A Small Good Thing, Errand, Are You a Doctor, Fat, Photograph of My Father in His 22nd Year, Lemonade, So Much Water, So Close to Home. And then finally, there's one story I should note from 94. In the December issue of Shincho, Murakami publishes The Zoo Attack, or A Clumsy Massacre, which will eventually become part of Book 3 of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. And this is 4 months after the publication of Books 1 and 2, so he's well on his way to that third volume. In 1995, Murakami puts out one collection of short fiction and one novel. On June 10th, he publishes The Spider Monkey Comes at Night, that's Jay Rubin's translation of the title for Yoru no Kumozaru, which I think I've mentioned at least once so far. These are shorts that were used as advertisements and were written in two separate sets. The first set was from April 85 to February 87, so he probably wrote many of these while he was in Europe. They were published in magazines like Men's Club, and they were advertisements for the clothing store J Press. There are 19 stories, and they're all really bizarre little shorts. Murakami notes that Itoi Shigesato was the kind of helped make this collection happen. And I think that they're kind of the spiritual successor to the stories he wrote with Itoi in that collection, Let's Meet in a Dream. The second set was published in the glossy magazine Tayo from April 93 to March 95, and they were this time ads for Parker pens. There are 24 stories in total. The tone is very same. They're very random. And again, both these collections have illustrations by Anzai Mizumaru. They're not too distant from the Kangoru Biori stories, but they're even shorter and more experimental and meta. He's playing with kana versus katakana, hiragana versus katakana. He's playing with different pronunciations of words. Watanabe Noboru, the real name for Anzai Mizumaru's real name, he uses Watanabe Noboru as this recurring character. And in one story, he comes to the narrator's house and asks to see the time machine. And the narrator is like, points to his kotatsu and is like, here's my time machine. And Watanabe Noboru is like, this is an amazing time machine. And so very random stories like that. He writes one on structuralism or maybe post-structuralism. I can't remember. I've written an article about this collection with David Marks over at Neo-Japanism, which I'll link in the blog. Definitely take a look at that. This is another excellent collection for any Murakami nerd. You can pick this up for really cheap online, as cheap as 1 yen and then 200 yen for shipping on Amazon, something like that. But it's a great collection because the illustrations are really beautiful and the stories are all very short, so it's good for new readers. This collection shows Murakami again getting into these very long sets of serializations, both for fiction and nonfiction, and a kind of commitment to constant productivity and lots of little bizarre ways to experiment and with different forms of fiction, different voices, different styles that he might not use in longer fiction. And then on August 25th, 1995, Murakami publishes The Wind Up Bird Chronicle Part 3, Book 3. Finally, after 3 years, The Wind Up Bird's publication is complete. It's a very different book, as I mentioned in the Power Rankings episode. It's a lot more meta. We get these sections of the book that aren't really narrated by the narrator, like Mei Kazuhara's letters, which start to alternate with narration at times. Online chats with Kumiko and her brother, some of which I think might be cut from the translation. We get the actual Wind Up Bird Chronicle written by Akasaka Cinnamon. And then we get this kind of historical writing, some of which seems to be written by Cinnamon, some of which is written by Lieutenant Mamiya, and again seems almost directly inspired by Carver's story Errand. This book wins the Yomiuri Prize in 1996 and is the book that brought Murakami into the mainstream attention in, I think, at least in the US. When I think of this book now, I think it makes me think of Hardboiled Wonderland, which is Murakami's other book to this point that had kind of grand ambitions that maybe possibly don't quite pull them off. Here, those ambitions are even grander and involve Japan's war history. Those sections of the book are really well told and I think work independently as stories, but he jettisons so much from the early parts of the book, especially the Kano sisters, who end up being almost irrelevant to the end of the book. Yet he still needs these characters like them that are kind of bizarre and have this intuition and help make connections. And so he introduces the Akasakas as replacements for them. To a certain extent, I really do think that anything Murakami is trying to say here, he's already said in a much more subtler, controlled way in Hear the Wind Sing and A Wild Sheep Chase. So it's a great book, but again, maybe too grand and its ambitions that it doesn't really tie together in the end. But yeah, after this, he'll take a little bit of a break from writing fiction for a while. In 1996, Murakami wrote 1 short story collection, 4 translations, and 2 nonfiction books. On January 1st, 1996, starting the year off bright and early, he publishes a translation of From Birdland to Broadway by Bill Crow, and that translation title is Sayonara Birdland, Aru Jazz Musician no Kaiso. This is a translation of a memoir by Bill Crow, a jazz bassist with Jerry Mulligan and other jazz players. He randomly discovered it at a bookstore while in Princeton, and luckily he was able to interview Crow because Crow also lived in Princeton at the time. Murakami asked him about using heroin, and apparently Crow was allergic to it, which kept him away from that part of the business at the time. I actually read this on my own and never realized that Murakami translated it. I don't remember it exactly, but I do remember enjoying it, and I remember it having some really awesome anecdotes, and also it being kind of divided into short little, very readable sections. So I highly recommend picking up a copy of that. On April 6th, Murakami publishes a translation of Ben's Dream by Chris Van Allsburg. The Japanese title is Ben no Mita Yume. This is another Allsburg illustrated book, originally published in 1982. So here Murakami is maybe catching up on some of the older works that he didn't get to yet. The next day, on April 7th, Murakami publishes a translation of Babylon Revisited, the Scott Fitzgerald Book 2, and the Japanese title is Babylon ni Kairu, the Scott Fitzgerald Book 2. Apologies for my terrible katakana pronunciation. This is a translation of 5 short stories from later in Fitzgerald's career. Those stories are The Jelly Bean, the Cut Glass Bowl, The Bridal Party, and Babylon Revisited. Murakami notes in his book on translations that he was using this as a step towards translating The Great Gatsby. On May 24th, Murakami publishes a collection of nonfiction titled How to Find a Whirlpool Cat, Uzumaki Neko no Mitsukekata. This is a column that he published in the Nature magazine Shinra from July 94 to October 95. When this book was republished in 2008 in a new version, he added the Murakami Asahido Journal subtitle to it. In this case, previously it was just Murakami Asahido, Murakami's House of the Rising Sun. Now he has John Naru attached to it. The content is about living in the U.S. He writes about really kind of random topics. He writes a little bit about how fat the people are there. He writes about how He doesn't find it very difficult to write novels while living abroad. He writes about finding a cat. It also includes a small pamphlet that has a Taidan conversation between Murakami and Anzai. This is another perfectly decent collection of nonfiction. I've read a little bit of it, and I have a few blog posts analyzing it that I'll link in the blog post. So take a look there to get a better idea of what he's writing about. On October 10th, Murakami publishes the translation of Shot in the Heart by Michael Gilmore. That Japanese title is Shinzo wo Tsuranukarete. This is a 1994 memoir from Gilmore, who is or was a Rolling Stone writer. It's about his brother Gary Gilmore, the first person to be executed after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Murakami says he translated this because his wife insisted. She had read it in English but wanted to read it in Japanese. Norman Mailer wrote about Gary Gilmore as well in The Executioner Song, but Murakami says that Gilmore's book is better. He also says that he was translating this while writing the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and says that the dark material probably influenced his own writing. On November 30th, Murakami publishes Lexington Ghosts, Rekishinton no Yurei. This is a collection of short stories. Those stories are Lexington Ghosts, The Little Green Monster, The Silence, The Iceman, Tony Takitani, The Seventh Man, and Blind Willow Sleeping Woman. All but one of these has been translated, and that is the title story. Some of these are from quite a long time before this collection. So Tony Takitani's from 1990, The Iceman 91, The Silence 91, The Little Green Monster also 91. And then there's 3 stories from 95 and 96. So kind of a varied collection that maybe Murakami needed to pad out or something. I'm not quite sure. But a decent enough little collection that is repackaging stuff that he's previously published also as well. So don't know what's going on with this collection. It's maybe a little bit of an afterthought, I would say, compared to many of his collections. But the new stories are good as well, especially Blind Willow Sleeping Woman, which feels a lot like it's connected to Norwegian Wood and that kind of era of his writing. And on December 5th, Murakami publishes Haruki Murakami Goes to Meet Hayao Kawai, Murakami Haruki Kawai Hayao ni Ainiku. This is a set of Taidan recorded conversations between Murakami and Jungian psychologist Hayao Kawai. I don't know too much about this. I haven't read it, but I think it shows his growing stature in Japan. This is just about 10 years after Norwegian Wood, and he can basically write and publish anything and is considered alongside most other intellectuals in the country. It has been translated, and reviews of the English version on Amazon kind of show what you might expect, which is that some readers weren't prepared for the Taidan format, that it probably needed to be packaged differently to meet reader expectations outside of Japan, at least in English. In 1997, Murakami publishes 4 books of nonfiction and 2 translations. On March 20th, he publishes Undergroundo. This is a set of interviews with survivors of the sarin gas attack that happened in Tokyo on March 20th, 1995. Murakami was curious about what they saw and how they felt, so he kind of felt compelled to do these interviews. And he also felt strongly pulled to the subterranean aspect of the incident, given his fiction's connections with wells and sewers. An interesting bit of trivia is that the editor was Kinoshita Yoko, none other than the editor at Kodansha involved putting out the hardcover of Hear the Wind Sing, and who wrote the blog post about the original title of Hear the Wind Sing that I mentioned in the last episode, and also the same person that Murakami name drops in Distant Drums as the person he calls after he finishes writing Norwegian Wood. Murakami had researchers working to help him with this collection, and they were the ones that put him in contact with the survivors. The first interview took place in December 1995, so much closer to the incident. On June 25th, Murakami publishes a translation of Wonderful Alexander and the Catwings by Ursula Le Guin. The Japanese title is Subarashi Alexander to Tsoratobi Nekotachi. This is the 3rd book in the Catwing series after a 4-year break for Murakami. On September 1st, Murakami publishes the translation of Volume 5 of the complete works of Raymond Carver, where water comes together with other water / ultramarine, and the Japanese translation of those titles are Mizu to Mizu ga deau tokoro, and Ultra Marine. These are two collections of Carver poetry. Murakami says that it was very difficult to capture all the symbolism of such densely poetic material in Japanese. And again, when Murakami met Carver in 1983, Carver was pleased that Murakami told him his poetry was novelistic and that his fiction was poetic. And this is the point in Murakami's translation book where he mentions that little anecdote. On October 10th, he published a short story guide for young readers, Wakai Dokusha no Tame no Tanpen Shousetsu Annai. This is a set of writing that was serialized in the magazine Hon no Hanashi from January 96 to February 97. Each piece of writing introduces one story from 6 different writers: Yoshiyuki Junnosuke, Kojima Nobuo, Yasuoka Shotaro, Shono Junzo, Maruya Shaiichi, and Hasegawa Shiro. Apparently, this was based on a course of sorts that Murakami taught while he was at Tufts, as working as a writer, and also discussions that he held with Bungei Shunju after returning to Japan. On December 20th, Murakami publishes a book of nonfiction writing called Portrait in Jazz, Portretto in Jazz. It's a book of essays about jazz musicians and their music. It's centered around illustrations by Wada Makoto, a famous artist who had done an exhibit of portraits of jazz musicians in 1992. Each essay looks at one album from one musician, and these are musicians like Chet Baker, Benny Goodman, Art Blakey, Billie Holiday, and others that are favorites of Murakami. The writing was serialized in Geijutsu Shinjo from June 96 to May 97. And now we're in 1998, and during which Murakami wrote 3 books of nonfiction, one fiction/children's book, not exactly a novel, but fiction still, I would say, and then one book of translation. On April 23rd, he publishes a book of nonfiction writing with the Japanese title Henkyo Kinkyo, which I would translate maybe as Near and Far. It's a book of travel writing about 7 different trips that he took between 1990 and 1997. The destination for those trips was the East Hamptons, a deserted island near Yamaguchi. He was in Mexico traveling for a month. He goes to Kagawa for Sanuki Udon, Nemonhan, where he was researching for the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. He travels across the U.S. from the East Coast to the West Coast, and then he writes a new essay for this collection about walking in Kobe. The writing was serialized in a lot of different magazines, Umi, Mother Nature, Shinra, and the Kobe piece was actually translated for Granta. This looks like a really interesting collection. Actually, it's at the top of my to-read list, or near the top, I would say, along with his other travel writing, I would say. On June 25th, he publishes a book of illustrated fiction titled Fua Fua, which loosely translates as Fluffy. It's a children's book illustrated by Anzai Mizumaru. It's narrated by an old tomcat, and it tells the story of a cat that he actually had as a pet growing up. I don't know much more about it other than that, and that it's, I guess, his first illustrated children's book, but maybe second work of illustrated fiction if you count the Sheepman's Christmas that was published back in the 80s. On July 1st, Murakami publishes CD-ROM Murakami Asahido, Dream Surf City. That Japanese title is CD-ROM-BAN Murakami Asahido Yume no Surf City. This is a very thin little book that includes a CD with it. Murakami had a homepage, a website from June 4th, 96 to November 11th, 97, where he published email exchanges with readers, and it served as a sort of forum for Murakami and his readers. The title comes from Murakami's nickname for Yakult Swallow second baseman Dobashi Katsuyuki. I have no idea what he did to deserve that nickname. If you know, please email me and I'll share it with everybody in the next episode. So he publishes all these reader exchanges on a CD, and then some of them in the written pages. These include his answers to questions. For example, the first one he responds to is from a reader who is sending their very first email and has set up their computer for this purpose of getting in touch with Murakami. In the afterword, he notes that he never really did radio or TV, and he doesn't do meet and greets or signature events where he's signing or book signings and things like that. He says that he feels a reader and writer should communicate purely through the writer's works. but that the internet provided a kind of distance that made him feel more comfortable with an activity like this. The book also includes some essays from the magazine Passo, edited by an editor named Dechi Igarashi. That's their pen name, and his real name is Igarashi Fumio, who was on Shukan Asahi before that. We know that Shukan Asahi is where Murakami has published some of these serialized nonfiction in the past, so it's some kind of connection there. We can see, again, Murakami involved with the literary community. Some of these posts that Murakami wrote on his website read a lot like blog posts. He's writing about what he brings on a trip, and he's name dropping the brand items like a Barbour coat, Timberland shoes, and a Timex watch. And in another one, he talks about the publicity tour he's going on for the Wind Up Bird Chronicle and how many interviews he's doing each day and how tired he is. So it reads a lot like what George Martin is doing right now on his blog website, but 20 odd years before the internet as we know it exists right now. On October 7th, Murakami publishes the translation of Mr. and Mrs. Baby and Other Stories by Mark Strand. The translation of that title is Inu no Jinsei, which must refer to one of the other stories in the collection, I assume, and is not a translation of Mr. and Mrs. Baby. This is a collection of short stories by Mark Strand, who is a Canadian-born American poet. He was poet laureate in 1990. Murakami found this collection of stories randomly at a used bookstore while living in Princeton. And he says that he likes his poetry. And actually, he quotes one of his poems in The Place We Were Promised, which is the follow-up to Underground. And maybe not coincidentally, that's the next book that Murakami publishes on November 30th. The Place We Were Promised, Underground 2. The Japanese title is Yakusoku Sareta Basho de Underground 2. This is the follow-up to Underground, in which Murakami interviews 8 former members of the Om Shinrikyo cult. It was serialized in Bunge Shunju from April 98 to September 98. And there's an afterword based on essays that Murakami published in the magazine Hon no Hanashi in the October 98 issue. And apparently it was not possible to do this book with the original team at Kodansha, so it was published with Bunge Shunju instead. And the title's taken from a Mark Strand poem titled An Old Man Awake in His Own Death, An Old Man Awake in His Own Death. And I can't read the whole poem for copyright reasons, but I'll read the first 2 stanzas to give you a sense of it. An old man awake in his own death. This is the place that was promised when I went to sleep, taken from me when I woke. This is the place unknown to anyone where names of ships and stars drift out of reach. And I'll link to the full poem in the blog post, so take a look there. This book, The Place We Were Promised, goes on to win the Kuwabara Takeo Prize for Writing in the Humanities. Moving along, we're in 1999, in which Murakami publishes 1 novel, 1 translation, and 1 book of nonfiction. The novel comes first on April 20th. It's Sputnik Sweetheart, Sputnik no Koibito. This book tells the story of Sumire. It's told by an unnamed narrator. Sumire is a kind of pixie dream girl who's an aspiring writer, and the narrator is deeply in love with her, but in an unrequited way. Sumire meets Mew, an older Zainichi Korean who's wealthy and runs an import business, and she eventually becomes Mew's assistant and helps her with this work in Europe. When Sumire disappears, Mew calls the narrator to ask for his help finding her, but it seems like there's no trace of her. Even after the narrator gets to Greece, he's only really able to uncover some of her writing, which shares stories about Mew and Sumire herself. She seems to have disappeared into another world, or this is the determination that the narrator makes. He eventually leaves Greece devastated and is inspired to split from the married woman that he's been seeing. And at the very end, he receives a phone call from Sumire, and that's the end of the book. Key points that I would note, this continues Murakami's shift to denser language that we saw in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle after the first part of his career, where the language was much lighter. It does feel like he's trying to recreate some of the magic of Norwegian Wood with the type of stories he's telling and the way the narration happens. And then even with the ending, it seems like an almost direct callback to the ending of Norwegian Wood. Here he's again looking at themes of unrequited love and humans' inability to know what they want or even truly know another person. On May 1st, he publishes the translation of Grace Paley's Enormous Changes at the Last Minute, Saigo no Shunkan no Sugoku Ookina Henka. Murakami translated a Paley story for the anthology and other stories. That was the first one he did, but this is the first collection of her short stories. He can't remember what his first inspiration was to translate her, but he's been linked with her ever since, and he finds it difficult to know why he felt compelled to translate her 3 collections. He calls the world of her fiction simple and forceful, and he feels really drawn in by it, despite the fact that he notes that he has almost nothing in common with her. She's the daughter of Russian immigrants, Jewish, grew up in Brooklyn. He's obviously a Japanese man. So I haven't read enough Grace Paley to really say anything about the connection here. The one thing I can note is that up until this point, Murakami really has only been a completionist translator for men, for Fitzgerald, for Carver, for Chandler. Grace Paley is the first woman writer that he's a completionist translator for. And on December 15th, Murakami publishes the work of nonfiction called If Our Words Were Whiskey, Moshi Bokura no Kotoba ga Whiskey de Atta Nara. This is a short little piece of travel writing from Islay, Scotland and Ireland. Murakami went to visit 3 distilleries. It was serialized in Suntory Quarterly from September 30th, 97 to December 15th, 97. So this is more like a piece of commercial writing along the lines of the commercial advertorial short fiction he did in Yoru no Kumozaru. I read it back in 2009, and I remember that he went to the Bowmore distillery, which happens to be owned by Suntory, and Murakami ended up calling it the most balanced of the ones that he visited. And I didn't think much of it at the time. I guess I probably didn't realize it was owned by Suntory. But now that seems like a little bit more of an obvious call by Murakami. The book also has photographs by his wife. It's a nice little read, and I would highly recommend it for somebody if you're interested in whiskey and Murakami. In 2000, Murakami publishes 1 collection of short fiction, 3 translations, and 2 works of nonfiction. On February 25th, he puts out the short story collection All God's Children Can Dance, Kami no Kodomo Tachi wa Minna Odoru. This is a collection that was serialized in the magazine Shincho from August to December of 1999 under the title After the Quake, Jishin no Ato. Those stories are UFO and Kushiro, Landscape with Flatiron, All God's Children Can Dance, Thailand, Super Frog Saves Tokyo, and then a new story, Honey Pie, which was kakioroshi and not serialized. And apparently it was Murakami himself who decided that After the Quake would make a better English title, and he also decided that the title should be in all lowercase. So we see him quite early on starting to exercise control over the titles of his translation, which I think is going to be very interesting with this new novel. This is Murakami's post-Kobe earthquake, post-sarin gas attack fiction. I think it shows Murakami almost always responding to the times in his writing. On May 10th, Murakami publishes a book of translated nonfiction called, they call it Stormy Monday, Getsuyobi wa Sayaku dato minna wa yu keredo. This is a series of literary essays that Murakami collected himself while living in America. The authors include Tim O'Brien and Richard Ford. He notes that this is right around when the news about Gordon Lish's editing of Raymond Carver's early stories made a big kind of scandal, and he says that it made him think really deeply. On July 7th, Murakami publishes the translation of Jazz Anecdotes by Bill Crow. This is a follow-up to From Birdland to Broadway. Murakami abridges it to include only musicians that would be familiar to Japanese readers, so he doesn't translate the whole book. Oh, and that Japanese title is Jazz Anecdotes. On August 1st, Murakami publishes a book of nonfiction called Yes, Let's Ask Murakami-san. The public bombards Murakami-san with 282 burning questions. Can he answer them? And the Japanese title is as ridiculous as it sounds in English. It is Soda, Murakami-san ni kiite miyou to seken no hitobito ga Murakami Haruki ni toriaizu butsukeru 280の大疑問に果たして村上春樹さんはちゃんと答えられるのか? And this is the print edition of questions from Murakami's website. with drawings from Anzai Mizumaru. So he's reusing some of this material that he put out on the CD earlier. This sold 140,000 copies, so people wanted to know the answers to these questions. And these are kind of silly questions. These are random questions that the readers are sending him. So, for example, I'll look at one on the website. I'll put a link in the blog post. But big question 42 is, do you put condoms in the refrigerator? And the reader says, I'm sorry to ask all of a sudden, but are condoms something that should be kept in the refrigerator? I'm house sitting for a male friend, and I found some in the butter tray when I was cleaning the fridge, from a Japanese teacher living in Los Angeles. Murakami responds, it must be one of the following. 1, they feel good when they're cold. 2, he can get them when somebody says, hey, bring me some more wine. 3, he couldn't think of anywhere else to keep them. And 4, he eats them on toast. So Murakami's clearly just kind of having fun with this project. On August 25th, Murakami publishes a translation of Call If You Need Me by Raymond Carver, Hitsuyou ni nattara denwa o kakete. This is not part of the Carver complete work. This is a set of posthumously published writing from Carver. Murakami says it was a little bit painful to translate them faithfully. There were places that he felt like things could have been worded differently, and he even felt like Carver must have known that many of them didn't even need to be published. On August 30th, Murakami publishes a book of something. It's hard to say what it is. It's called Matatabi Abita Tama. I'll leave that Japanese title because there's really no good way to translate it. It's a book of Japanese palindromes, one for each kana in the Japanese syllabary, and with a short story about that palindrome. J. Rubin translates the title as Tama Showered in Catnip, but obviously that's not a palindrome in English, so they just don't work in translation. But the title palindrome is about a cat covered in catnip. They're illustrated by Tomozawa Mimio and have like very karuta-like drawings with them. Karuta being the Japanese traditional matching card game. J. Rubin says that Murakami wrote them during a down period during the New Year's holidays, so it just shows that he's a total workhorse. He is always writing something. And then on October 20th, Murakami publishes a book called Tales of Translation. The Japanese is Honyaku Yawa, literally evening Tales of Translation. This collects several Taidan conversations, one from a workshop with Shibata Motoyuki, a famous translator, and then another with students at Babel University. It also has short stories by Paul Auster and Raymond Carver that are translations. All right, we're in the home stretch. It's 2001. Murakami publishes 3 works of nonfiction and 1 translation. On January 20th, he publishes Sydney! In Japanese, that is Shidoni! Bikkurimaku. And these are based on essays published in the magazine Sports Graphic Number, which Murakami has written for a number of different times now. They're mostly essays on sports, like the Olympics. I haven't read them, but I swear that I read an interview with him about his writing in this collection, and I may have even blogged about it, but I can't seem to track it down right now. He said that this is really the point where he developed the confidence to output the volume of writing he's been able to do. And I found a quote, I think on Japanese Wikipedia, that is, 正直言ってこれほど短期間にこれほど大量の大量の完成原稿を書いたのは作家になって20年初めてのことだった。So this was the first point in his 20-year career where he had put out this much finished manuscript pages, this huge amount of finished manuscript pages in such a short period of time. So that's, I think I have somewhere that he wrote 10 manuscript pages a day, which is 4,000 Japanese characters, loosely 2,000 English words or so if you do the standard math. That's a lot of writing, especially of like complete publishable work. I guess doing that for days on end, however many days he did it for this project, I guess that'll change a person. So pretty impressive. On April 1st, Murakami publishes CD-ROM Murakami Asahido, Smerdyakov versus Oda Nobunaga's Vassals. Japanese, that's CD-ROM Ban Murakami Asahido, Smerdyakov Tai Oda Nobunaga Kashindan. This is basically the same as the Surf City collection. It's a set of essays and questions from readers with a CD in the back. Murakami started up his Asahido website again from February 14th, 98 to November 18th, 99. He's repackaging old material here. They're basically blog posts. He talks about the movies he watched, like the bad remake of Godzilla, which he saw in the US, the publication of his books, like Near and Far. He talks about the closure of Dunkin' Donuts, which happened around this time in Japan. He says that quality control was lacking and that it wasn't as good as Mr. Donuts. And the title of the collection comes from a reader question. On April 25th, Murakami publishes a set of nonfiction writing called Portrait in Jazz 2, Portretto in Jazz 2. This is the second volume of jazz essays coordinated with Wada Makoto's portraits. He's writing about Sonny Rollins, Wes Montgomery, Oscar Peterson, and others. And it looks like he eventually collected both volumes into one with extra material. Again, this is Murakami writing like a musician, putting out extra CDs with bonus tracks to incentivize readers to buy again. On June 8th, Murakami publishes a set of nonfiction called Murakami Radio, Murakami Radio. These are columns that were serialized in An, the fashion magazine, women's magazine, from March 17th, 2000 to March 3rd, 2001. They were illustrated by Ohashi Ayumi and edited for publication. This is kind of funny because Murakami pokes fun at An in A Wild Sheep Chase. His girlfriend describes something, I can't remember exactly what, and the narrator says, that's exactly how they would describe that in An. The title, Murakami Radio, is taken from his 96-97 website. He had a section called Murakami Updates that he would adjust to Murakami Radio, and he would go on to use this as the homepage. Based on Wikipedia, from what I can see, the content is random as usual. I think I picked it up at some point and flipped through it years ago, but it just has random essays that he normally has been writing. For example, one is about how ages 16 to 21 are the best ages for falling in love, which seems like a very Murakami thing to say based on his early fiction. Murakami will go on to use this title for the radio show that he starts in 2018. And then Murakami ends the year on September 20th with a translation of Jane on Her Own by Ursula Le Guin. That Japanese title is Sora o Kakeru Jane, Soratobi Neko Monogatari. This is the last of the Cat Wings books. In 2002, Murakami publishes one novel, 3 translations, and he begins to put out the next set of his complete works. On May 15th, he publishes a translation of Truman Capote's Children on Their Birthdays, Tanjobi no Kodomotachi. This is an original selection of 6 Capote stories, including some that he previously translated. On July 7th, he publishes Volume 7 of the complete works of Raymond Carver, No More Heroics. In Japanese, that's Eiyu o Utao Mai. These are short stories from Carver's early career, the starts of novels, uncollected poems, introductions to books, essays, reviews. And Murakami, he makes a note and that seems to recognize that some of this material will be tough for regular readers to get through, that this is really only for the fanatics. On September 10th, Murakami publishes Kafka on the Shore, Umibe no Kafka. This is Oedipus in a Murakami wrapper. He's telling alternating stories. Tamara Kafka runs away from home in Tokyo to Takamatsu, where he ensconces himself in a library and gets into sexual escapades for the very first time. Nakata is an older disabled man, potentially disabled from a war experience, who makes his own pilgrimage to Takamatsu while fighting off pop culture mascots. I think really one of the only interesting things to say about this novel is the fact that it's told in alternating tales, which is a technique that Murakami has used in the past, but here he borrows from Alfred Birnbaum's translation of Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World. That book was told in past tense for both sections of the narrative in Japanese. But in translation, Birnbaum and his editor Elmer Luke made the really bold decision to translate the End of the World sections in present tense. I would say that the style of the narration in Japanese does lend it a kind of eternal present tense feel, despite the fact that it's told in past tense. But that said, it's pretty clear that Murakami is inspired by this translation choice and uses it for himself in this book. One other thing to note about Kafka on the Shore is that the PR strategy has influenced Murakami's subsequent novels. With Kafka on the Shore, there was about a year-long period, or maybe even over a year, between when Murakami turned in the manuscript and when they published it. And they did various PR strategies to publicize the release of the book. Unfortunately, that led to spoilers, apparently, and many readers complained, I guess. They complained enough that when Murakami went to publish 1Q84 in 2009, they said, why not as an experiment? Let's try not publishing anything about the content of the novel. And that seems to have become more or less standard practice for Murakami since then, although I can't remember if that was true for After Dark, but it's been true for the 3 novels after Dark. On November 20th, the first volume of the Murakami Haruki Zensakuhin 1990 to 2000 comes out. This is Short Stories 1, Tanpen Shu Ichi. This collects stories from TV People, Yoru no Kumozaru, and Fua Fua, or Fluffy, and then the Yoru no Kumozaru is the Spider Monkey Comes at Night. It also includes the new story Losing Blue. And on December 7th, Murakami publishes the anthology of short stories, translated short stories, Birthday Stories. This is a set of stories about birthdays, plus his own story called Birthday Girl. The authors he's translating include Dennis Johnson, David Foster Wallace, Raymond Carver, Claire Keegan, Andrea Lee, and Paul Theroux. It goes into English almost as it is 2 years later. I guess probably would have been very little work to put it in English, given that all the stories are in English already, and you would just need to translate Murakami's. This collection is notable just because it's the first anthology collection that Murakami's putting together, which is something that he'll come to do several times moving forward. It seems to be an activity that he likes, even though it presents a challenge. And I've got one quick little story to share at the end of 2002. In fall 2002, I don't remember exactly when, Murakami attended the New Yorker Festival, which is a literary event held in New York City every year by the New Yorker. He did a signing at the Barnes & Noble in Union Square, and I was studying in Boston at the time, so I took a bus from Boston and stayed on the couch of one of my friends who was studying at Columbia. This was like my first time in New York on my own. I was like probably 20 or 21, depending on whether it was September or October. I was probably 20, actually. And I was 20 because I remember my friend went out the night before and he invited me to go out. And I was like, I don't have a fake ID. I can't go. So I just kind of like went to bed early. I got up at like 6 or 7 in the morning because I was so nervous and I had no idea what to expect. I had breakfast at like a Starbucks or some kind of coffee shop right across from the Barnes & Noble. And I was there at the door when they opened at whatever time that was, like 8 or 9. I think it was 9, and Murakami didn't sign until 10. So I stood around for like an hour, like making friends and talking with people, like really in a very excited way. And all the friends I made all had blogs, and we shared our blogs. It was ridiculous. But that's what life was like in 2000. So while we were standing around making friends, we were totally unaware that a line was forming, a very long line. And when we got in line, we were at the very end, and some staff from Barnes & Noble stood like 5 or 6 people in front of us and was like, everyone after this point is not guaranteed a signature. And I was like totally heartbroken. And I was like, oh my God, I came all this way and I'm not going to get a signature. But Murakami, as we know, he works quickly. He got through the line like nothing. He got through that line in like probably 10 minutes. And he was signing for like an hour. And so everyone went through the line like multiple times. I didn't have the heart to do it because I hadn't said anything the first time through. And I knew if I went through again, I would probably try and say something silly in Japanese and embarrass myself. But I just kind of stood there watching him sign books for a while and then went out to get like coffee with friends that I had made. And it was cool. It was a really cool event. And I think really is representative of his level of popularity at that point. Like he was very clearly one of the main attractions, but it wasn't the point where like it was totally overwhelming the facilities. I remember there was a guy there that had like a first edition of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle in like extremely good condition, like with like maybe even a plastic cover on it or something. And I remember saying, "Oh wow, you just had a first edition signed. That's really cool." He's like, and he said, "I have first editions of everyone." And so it was clear that like maybe Murakami was cool, but he wasn't like he had everyone's first edition. It wasn't like only Murakami's. I think that changes in the next couple of years. I think his popularity goes to another level. In 2003, Murakami continues to put out his next set of complete works. He also publishes 2 translations and 2 works of nonfiction. On January 20th, he publishes volume 2 of his complete works, 1990 to 2000, which includes South of the Border, West of the Sun, and Sputnik Sweetheart. And on March 20th, he puts out volume 3, which is short stories set 2 and includes the stories in Lexington's Ghost and All God's Children Can Dance. As best I can tell, there are no extra short stories included with this volume. And as far as the novels go, it's a really interesting combination. South of the Border, West of the Sun from 92, Sputnik Sweetheart in 99. Very different, but also both kind of minor Murakami works. Sputnik was only published 4 years previously, which is kind of astounding when you think about putting out a set of complete works. And it makes me wonder whether or not Murakami maybe regretted starting to collect his complete works so early. He hasn't done a set for the following 20 years after that, and you might have expected those to come along in 2013 or right around now if the timing was similar. So I wonder whether it's an economic decision or maybe a personal decision. There might not just be much of a market for complete works in terms of readership, or maybe Murakami just doesn't want to put out the collection yet. And then there's the third possibility that it's just not feasible because 2000 to 2010 would include 1Q84, which is just an enormous book. I think it's 6 volumes in the Bunkobon version and 3 in the hardcover. And putting that out again in addition to a whole other range of writing just might not be feasible. He has put out so much writing. On April 20th, Murakami publishes the translation of The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. That title is Kyacha in the Rai. Japan had a really famous translation of this novel already when Murakami's was published, and one thing Murakami did to make his distinct was use a katakana title. The original translation's title was Rai Mugi Batake de Tsukamaete. Murakami received pretty harsh feedback for this, he says, and he compares it to a rat being chased by a cat with a bell on its collar. He reread the translation by Nozaki Takashi, which is the famous Rai Mugi Batake translation. And he says that it's good, but that it's aged a bit in terms of the language, and that he thinks The Catcher in the Rye is a work that needs multiple translations. He was really interested to take on a work that has had such an effect on people, and he cites specifically Mark David Chapman, not by name, but in the fact that it was involved in John Lennon's death. On May 20th, Murakami publishes Volume 4 of his complete works, 1990 to 2000. This is books 1 and 2 of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. Book 3 is published 2 months later on July 19th. In between those two, Murakami on June 10th publishes a book called Young Kafka, Shounen Kafka. Murakami had another website from August 10th, 2002 to February 14th, 2003. The website ended at that point, and it had interviews, details about upcoming publications, reader emails. And in this book, Shounen Kafka, Murakami publishes over 1,000 of these reader responses that he's answered. And it was published, from what I remember, it was in a big, really chunky magazine form, almost like a monthly manga magazine. It had Anzai Mizumaru illustrations and Yonkoma manga, which are the kind of 4 square manga, very typical manga for a lot of writers, especially online these days. So this is just another example of Murakami interacting with readers online and then finding ways to package that in print. On July 20th, he publishes Tales of Translation 2, Salinger's War Diary. That's Honyaku Yawa 2, Sarinja Senki. This collects 2 Taidan conversations with Shibata Motoyuki, the translator, and 2 essays, one by Murakami and one by Shibata, both about Catcher in the Rye. I haven't read them, but I assume that they touch on Salinger's War Diary at some point. You might recognize Shibata's name by now. He's been involved with Murakami since the very early days when he was translating, and they've really been productive together. On September 20th, Murakami publishes the 6th volume of his complete works, 1990 to 2000. This is Underground. And then on November 20th, he publishes the 7th and final volume of this 1990 to 2000 complete works. This includes The Place We Were Promised and Haruki Murakami Goes to Meet Hayao Kawai. And then he ends the year on November 21st with a translation of The Wretched Stone by Chris Van Allsburg, and in Japanese that is Ima Ima Shi Ishi. And this is another illustrated children's book. It was originally published in 1991, so again, Murakami is occasionally publishing contemporaneously with Van Allsburg and at other times going into his back catalog. Moving on to 2004, Murakami publishes 3 works of translations, 1 novel, and 1 book of nonfiction. On March 15th, he publishes the translation of July, July by Tim O'Brien, and that Japanese title is Sekai no Subete no Shichigatsu. Murakami says he felt generationally compelled to translate this novel given the subject matter. It was serialized in English and then edited for publication, which is O'Brien's style, almost like writing short stories over an extended period of time, Murakami notes. He translated them as they were serialized and then had to kind of rework them. He says that the novel wasn't well received in English and that the response was basically, oh, not another book about the 60s. But to Murakami, he says that just emphasizes how intense and experienced that decade was. On July 25th, Murakami publishes Volume 8 of the complete works of Raymond Carver, Call Me If You Need Me, Hitsuyou ni nattara demo o kakete. This is the final volume of Carver's complete works, and Murakami says that because of the extended period of time that he was translating from 1990 to 2004, he was able to make revisions to some of these texts up to 3 times. And we know that he started translating Carver before that, so we've seen him change the titles here and there, and I think he was doing some work to the actual works themselves as well. Ultimately, this complete work set includes translations from his 30s to his 50s. Murakami says that it was fun, but also a heavy responsibility, and that his writing style changed over that period of time, and he was grateful to be able to revise. On September 7th, Murakami publishes the novel After Dark, After Dark. This is the story of a single night in Tokyo. Asai Eri, a woman named Asai Eri, sleeps in a bed and is observed by a seemingly malevolent presence. The point of view is kind of very neutral and objective, almost robotic, zooming in on places in Tokyo from a bird's eye view up to observing conversations between people. Eri's sister Mari spends the night at a family restaurant and is drawn into drama at a love hotel by an acquaintance, Takahashi Tetsuya, who knows her sister. A Chinese prostitute there has been beaten by an office worker named Shirakawa who got away, but we get observations of him too from this point of view, and Shirakawa seems to have a split personality of some sort. And we meet others involved with this love hotel over the course of the night. The key points here, I think, is that this is Murakami experimenting with a very different style. This is arguably his first third-person novel. Murakami says he wrote the dialogue here first and then filled out the rest of the novel. He's addressing some similar themes, humans and systems and how they interact, life in a city, how violence can kind of incidentally affect others. And apparently this was inspired by a Robert Enrico movie called Tante Zita about a night out in Paris. I'll post a link to some clips from that movie in the blog post. On September 1st, Murakami publishes a translation of Two Bad Ants by Chris Van Allsburg. This is another illustrated children's book. The Japanese title is Nihiki no Ikenai Ari. It was originally published in 1988. And on November 15th, Murakami publishes a work of nonfiction. I'll give the Japanese title first. It is Tokyo Surume Karabu, Chikyu no Hagurekata. And I guess a translation that I'm not too confident in would be something like Tokyo Dried Squid Club, How to Veer Away from the Earth. This is a collection of travel writing that was co-written with Yoshimoto Yumi and Tsuzuki Kyoichi. Yoshimoto is apparently introduced in a Murakami essay, I don't know which one, as a neighbor who's crazy about the Yakult swallows. She was an assistant to Ohashi Ayumi, the illustrator for Murakami Radio, and wrote for women's magazines and was an interior stylist. Suzuki Kyoichi is a really known journalist and photographer. His books, Tokyo Style and Roadside Japan, are super famous and make great coffee table books. They're photographs of kind of almost anti Marie Kondo style Japan. These messy apartments filled with records and guitars and things like that. Worth picking up. These essays were serialized in Title, the magazine Title, irregularly between 2002 and 2004, and are travel writing. These three go to Nagoya, Atami, Hawaii, Enoshima, the Sakhalin Islands, and the Kiyosato Highlands in Yamanashi Prefecture. While in Nagoya, Murakami covers a love hotel and is able to see the employee room there, which inspires After Dark, I think. I'll post a link to Suzuki Kyoichi's Instagram page, which is worth a follow. And we made it to 2005, in which Murakami publishes one work of fiction, 2 short story collections, and 1 nonfiction work, and 3 translations. On February 7th, he publishes The Strange Library, Fushigi na Toshokan. This is an illustrated book with illustrations by Sasaki Maki based on a set of stories, Toshokan Kitan, Mysterious Stories from the Library, which was published in A Perfect Day for Kangaroos in 1983. So again, this is Murakami reworking past material in a different format for readers. The language is updated to a more kind of storybook friendly language, and but otherwise it tells the same story. Not dissimilar from The Sheepman's Christmas, I would say. This eventually comes into English in 2014. On March 30th, Murakami publishes The Elephant Vanishes, Selected Stories, 1980 to 1991, Zou no Shoumetsu Tanpen Senshu. So this is a really interesting collection. It's a republication of the stories that were published in this English collection that was the first collection of Murakami's stories translated into English. Interestingly, Murakami makes some changes to the works. Birnbaum, in particular, had made some adjustments to things like the story Lederhosen for publication, and Murakami reverse imports these changes and translates them back into Japanese. One thing in particular that he does is he changes the final sentence of the story from a line of dialogue to something a little bit more kind of pushing home the point. This shows that Murakami can be edited when he wants to be edited, I think, that he recognized good changes in his writing. But in David Karashima's book, Who We're Reading When We're Reading Murakami, he notes very explicitly that when changes are made to his work for something like The New Yorker, he changes it back for the book publication. So two kind of conflicting ideas here with Murakami's experience being edited. This collection has 2 introductory essays, one by Murakami about the time when Elephant Vanishes was published in English, and another by a big-time editor at Knopf, Gary Fisketjon, who I should note was dismissed in 2019 over a quote-unquote breach of policy that I'm not going to speculate about. But there was an interesting email exchange between Murakami's translators on the Random House website, and it includes a message from Fisketjon about The Elephant Vanishes, and Jay Rubin had kind of asked about how the stories were selected, and Fisketjon says, I studied what was available and picked, to my own taste, the best. I don't think I paid attention to who translated whichever story or for that matter, much else about my decision-making process. I still recall vividly, though, that I was seeing sides of Haruki's fiction that were altogether unfamiliar to me based on what I'd read. For example, Barn Burning struck me at the time as very Carver-like in a strongly, surprisingly pleasant way. I also thought the collection we put together was pretty much drop-dead terrific, and in fact it enjoyed sales and reviews beyond most collections, even by not well-known American writers. This collection is another example of Murakami being re-imported back to Japan. We saw this with some of the illustrated works of his fiction that were imported back from Germany. People in here are curious to know how Japanese are viewed abroad, and I see that that's probably particularly true for athletes and artists, and Murakami is no different. So this is a very interesting collection from that point of view. On July 30th, Murakami publishes a translation of Grace Paley's The Little Disturbances of Man. The Japanese title is Jinsei no Chotto shita Wazurai. Murakami, in his book on translation, compares Paley's writing to a knuckleball pitcher, saying, you never know where it's going to end up, but that she never changes, she's always the same, yet you never get tired of her writing. On September 18th, Murakami publishes a book of short stories called Strange Tales from Tokyo, Tokyo Kitanshu. This is a set of stories that was serialized in the magazine Shincho between March 2005 and June 2005, I think. Yeah. And those stories are Chance Traveler, Hanalei Bay, Where I'm Likely to Find It, The Kidney-Shaped Stone That Moves Every Day, and Shinagawa Monkey, which was a kakioroshi and not serialized. You might recognize these from the English collection Blind Willow's Sleeping Woman, or they were also serialized very shortly after being written. I believe in Blind Willow's Sleeping Woman, they're the last 5 or 6 stories in that collection. So they're kind of lumped together almost in the same way that they were in Japanese translation, which is interesting. We're getting closer to experiencing Murakami as he is experienced in Japan, I would say, at this point. The premise for this collection is also familiar. These are supposedly true stories related by someone to Murakami, and he's writing them out and telling them to the reader. This is a reuse of the device from his 85 collection, Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round. He doesn't write an introduction to the collection, I don't think. He includes in the very first story the premise that these are true stories. He also doesn't have a confession afterwards, which is what he did in his complete works in 91. But that final story, Shinagawa Monkey, amounts to a confession. It's a story about talking monkey who steals people's names. So to me, this is saying these are fictional stories. I'm going to give you these true stories and then one about a talking monkey. I don't know what to make about that too much, other than the fact that Murakami will return to the Shinagawa Monkey, we'll see, and the fact that Murakami likes this technique of having the narrator hear a story, be in dialogue with someone, and then switch over to being this kind of more omniscient third-person narrator when he's telling someone else's story. That switching back, I think, creates an interesting tension, is easy on the reader because it maintains interest. It can speed things along. You can be concise with your storytelling. And it's just fun to tell stories, I think. I think that's what Murakami's doing here. And yes, at this point, the translators have caught up to Murakami just about. On September 1st, 2005, Murakami publishes a translation of Chris Van Allsburg's The Garden of Abdul Gasazi. The Japanese title is Majutsushi Abduru Gasazi no Teien. This is another of Van Allsburg's illustrated picture books, and actually it's the first one he wrote in 1979. On November 25th, Murakami publishes a book titled, I guess in English you'd put it, It Don't Swing a Thing If It Ain't Got That Meaning, a play on the jazz standard, and that Japanese title is Imi ga nakereba swing wa nai. This is a set of essays serialized in stereo sound from spring 2003 to summer 2005, a collection of music criticism essays. The topics include Brian Wilson, Schubert, Stan Getz, Bruce Springsteen, Wynton Marsalis, Woody Guthrie, Cedar Walton, amongst others. As always, Murakami's musical interests are extremely varied, and he knows a ton. And finally, we have on November 28th, Murakami publishes a translation of The Cat Who Liked Potato Soup, an illustrated children's book by Terry Farish and Barry Root. The Japanese title is Potato Soup ga Daisuki na Neko. He says he randomly found this in a bookstore in the US and liked the title. He notes that the children's book industry is usually really on top of the latest releases, so he was surprised that this one hadn't been translated. It must have slipped through the cracks somehow. And he really urges people to visit bookstores. It's worthwhile to kind of discover things that way. And that's it. That's 17 years of Murakami's career in 90 minutes. If you made it this far, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Track me down in Osaka and I will buy you a beer because you are awesome. At this point, Murakami is in residence at Harvard. So he's back in Boston after spending a good amount of time in Japan. He is, I think, just a writer in residence, to be honest. And Jay Rubin tells a story of a public reading he did at MIT during this time. and 1,500 people showed up for 500 seats. So I think that shows a nice contrast with the New Yorker Festival. Murakami is now hugely popular in the United States, around the world, basically. And we have another 17 years of his career to look at in the next episode. I'll be putting out this next episode, I think probably early next week, so that I can fit in one more additional episode before the release of his novel on the 13th. Look for that. That's going to have some thoughts about the language Murakami might use, and some additional thoughts maybe about Hardball Wonderland and some passages from that I've looked at. So thanks again for tuning in, and yeah, hope you're getting excited for this new novel. Can't wait.